What if one of the world's greatest civilizations didn't emerge from a desert, but from a land filled with rivers, forests, and endless grasslands? Thousands of years ago, the Sahara looked nothing like it does today. Hidden beneath its endless sands may lie the forgotten traces of people who built remarkable lives long before history began. Could an entire civilization have flourished here and then vanished without a trace? Today, we'll uncover the astonishing evidence behind one of archaeology's greatest mysteries. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next journey into humanity's forgotten past. There is a place on Earth where endless dunes now stretch beyond the horizon, where summer heat shimmers above barren stone, and where rain may not fall for years. It is difficult to imagine birds gathering over wide lakes here, elephants wandering across open grasslands, or fishermen casting nets into water so vast that the opposite shore disappears into the haze. Yet this seemingly impossible landscape once existed. Long before the Sahara became the largest hot desert on the planet, it was something almost unrecognizable, a living world of rivers, wetlands, forests, and rolling savannas that supported thousands upon thousands of people. Today, satellites passing high above the desert quietly reveal faint lines hidden beneath the sand. Dry river channels snake across the landscape like ghosts of forgotten waterways. Ancient lake beds emerge where no water remains. Beneath drifting dunes lie traces of camps, tools, graves, pottery, and mysterious stone monuments that have not seen daylight for thousands of years. Every new discovery challenges one of humanity's oldest assumptions that the Sahara has always been empty. Instead, what survives in the archaeological record suggests something far more remarkable. For several thousand years during the early Holocene, much of North Africa experienced a dramatically wetter climate. Rainfall arrived regularly. Rivers flowed where only dry valleys remain today. Gigantic freshwater lakes spread across enormous depressions. Grasslands stretched for hundreds of kilometers, creating one of the richest environments on the continent. The transformation seems almost unbelievable when viewed through modern eyes. Standing in today's Sahara, surrounded by endless dunes and scattered rock, it requires an extraordinary leap of imagination to picture hippos cooling themselves in deep pools while crocodiles rested nearby. Herds of antelope grazed alongside giraffes, buffalo, and wild cattle. Ostriches crossed open plains. Fish thrived in lakes connected by seasonal rivers. Even species now associated with tropical Africa once occupied lands that today receive almost no rain at all. This forgotten landscape did not exist for only a brief moment. It endured long enough for entire generations to know nothing else. Children were born beside lakes whose shorelines slowly shifted with the seasons. Families learned where fish gathered after floods. Hunters memorized migration routes followed by animals that have long since vanished from these regions. Over centuries, people adapted not to survival in a desert, but to abundance within a thriving ecosystem. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Understanding how this remarkable world emerged requires looking far beyond human history. The changes began not with kings or empires, but with subtle variations in Earth's orbit around the Sun. These slow astronomical cycles altered the intensity and seasonal distribution of sunlight reaching the northern hemisphere. As summer heating strengthened over North Africa, powerful monsoon systems pushed much farther north than they do today. Moisture that now falls over Central Africa travelled deep into what is presently one of the driest places on Earth. The result was the African humid period, an interval beginning roughly 11,000 years ago when rainfall transformed immense portions of the Sahara. Lakes filled naturally across low-lying basins. Rivers connected distant regions. Vegetation expanded rapidly. Dust levels decreased dramatically as plants stabilized the soil. From space, the region would have appeared less like a desert and more like an immense mosaic of grasslands, wetlands, woodlands, and freshwater systems. Nature responded with astonishing speed. Animal populations expanded into territories that had previously been inhospitable. Birds followed new wetlands during seasonal migrations. Large mammals dispersed across landscapes rich with food and water. Every successful migration created new ecological relationships, gradually producing one of the most biologically diverse environments in prehistoric Africa. Humans followed these opportunities as they always had throughout their long history. Mobile hunter-gatherer groups moved into newly hospitable territories, discovering landscapes capable of supporting larger communities than before. They did not enter an untouched paradise. They entered an ecosystem already flourishing with life, where rivers offered fish, grasslands attracted game-edible plants grew in abundance, and fresh water reduced one of the greatest challenges facing prehistoric populations. Unlike later civilizations remembered through written records, these people left no surviving text describing their world. Everything known about them comes from fragments, patiently recovered by archaeologists. Stone tools scattered across ancient shorelines reveal repeated occupation. Animal bones indicate hunting and fishing practices. Grinding stones preserve evidence of plant processing. Pottery fragments demonstrate growing technological skill. Burials hint at emotional lives and evolving cultural traditions. Each discovery contributes another small piece to a story that remained almost invisible until modern science began looking beneath the sand. One of the most surprising aspects of this prehistoric landscape is its scale. The Green Sahara was not confined to a handful of isolated oases. Favorable conditions extended across millions of square kilometers. Some enormous lakes rivaled the size of modern inland seas. Paleo Lake Mega-Chad, for example, occupied an area vastly larger than today's Lake Chad. Shorelines now stranded hundreds of kilometers from modern water levels testify to the immense volumes that once existed. The evidence is visible not only underground but also across towering cliffs and rocky plateaus, where prehistoric artists created thousands of engravings and paintings. These images portray cattle, giraffes, elephants, swimmers, hunters, and daily activities impossible to reconcile with the modern desert environment. They are not fantasies. They are records of observation, preserving memories of landscapes their creators knew firsthand. Scholars continue debating exactly how populations were organized across this immense region. The evidence remains incomplete because only a tiny fraction of archaeological sites has been excavated. Shifting dunes conceal countless locations. Many ancient settlements remain inaccessible beneath meters of sand. Others have been destroyed by erosion or buried beyond the reach of current investigations. Every field season uncovers new surprises while reminding researchers how much remains hidden. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not simply that people lived here, but how completely their world disappeared. Lakes evaporated, rivers faded, grasslands retreated, animals migrated or vanished. Entire ways of life dissolved into memory long before the first pyramids rose along the Nile. Without written history, later civilizations remembered almost nothing of those who once flourished across this fertile landscape. The desert gradually erased their villages, covered their camps, and concealed their monuments beneath waves of drifting sand. Yet the land never forgot. Every buried shoreline, every abandoned hearth, every carefully crafted stone blade waits silently beneath the dunes, preserving evidence that one of humanity's most extraordinary prehistoric landscapes existed where few would ever think to search. The Sahara that dominates maps today is only the latest chapter in a much longer story, and beneath its immense silence rests the possibility that an entire network of thriving societies once connected lakes, rivers, and grasslands across the heart of North Africa, leaving behind clues that are only now beginning to emerge into the light. Section 2. The first people who entered the Green Sahara did not arrive with grand plans to build a civilization. They came because the land itself invited them. Across countless generations, human communities had learned to recognize opportunity wherever climate shifted in their favor. When rains returned to North Africa, the transformation unfolded slowly enough that each generation experienced it as a familiar world rather than an extraordinary event. Valleys that had once carried only occasional floodwater became dependable rivers. Seasonal ponds expanded into permanent lakes. Fresh grass covered plains that had previously supported little life. The change did not happen overnight, but over centuries it reshaped one of the largest landscapes on Earth. Archaeological evidence suggests that hunter-gatherer groups gradually expanded into these newly productive environments, beginning around 11,000 years ago. They were descendants of people who had already survived dramatic climatic swings at the end of the last ice age. Adaptability was one of their greatest strengths. Instead of remaining tied to a single homeland, they followed water-migrating animals and seasonal resources with remarkable flexibility. The Green Sahara rewarded that flexibility. Fish became one of the region's most reliable food sources. Ancient harpoons carved from bone have been recovered from sites that now lie hundreds of kilometers from the nearest permanent water. Stone sinkers likely used for fishing nets appear alongside carefully shaped hooks and blades. At several former lake shores, dense accumulations of fish bones reveal repeated harvesting over many generations. These discoveries indicate that communities return to the same productive waters year after year, developing an intimate understanding of seasonal cycles. Fishing alone, however, could never sustain the remarkable growth visible in the archaeological record. The surrounding grasslands offered extraordinary diversity. Gazelles, antelope, wild cattle, hares, birds, turtles, and countless smaller animals occupied different ecological niches. Hunters refined techniques suited to each environment, combining persistence, cooperation, and detailed knowledge of animal behavior. Stone projectile points found across the Sahara display impressive craftsmanship with regional variations, suggesting that different communities developed their own preferred technologies while remaining broadly connected through shared traditions. Plant resources were equally important, although they survive less readily in archaeological deposits. Grinding stones recovered from numerous sites preserved microscopic traces indicating the processing of wild grasses, seeds, and other edible plants. Gathering was not merely an occasional supplement to hunting. It formed a dependable foundation that reduced risk when animal migrations shifted unexpectedly, or fishing yields declined. Women, men, and children likely contributed in different ways depending on season, local ecology, and cultural practice, although the precise division of labor remains uncertain. As food became more predictable, settlement patterns began to change. Evidence from several regions suggests that people lingered longer at favored locations, camps grew larger, hearths accumulated over repeated occupations. Storage pits appear at some sites, hinting that certain foods were preserved rather than consumed immediately. This gradual increase in permanence did not mean these communities abandoned mobility altogether. Instead, many probably followed annual cycles, returning repeatedly to familiar places that became anchors within much larger seasonal territories. One of the more surprising discoveries from the Green Sahara is the sophistication of its pottery. Some of Africa's earliest ceramic vessels appear in this region dating back thousands of years before pottery became common in many other parts of the world. These containers were often decorated with intricate impressions created by cords, combs, or carved tools pressed into wet clay. The decorative patterns were not simply functional, they reflected shared traditions, aesthetic preferences, and perhaps even social identities that connected communities across considerable distances. The invention or early adoption of pottery transformed everyday life in subtle but significant ways. Durable vessels allowed people to boil foods that previously could not be cooked efficiently. Tough plant fibers softened, seeds released more nutrients, fish stews and gathered grains became easier to prepare. Ceramic containers also improved storage, protecting valuable food from insect and moisture. Small technological innovations such as these often leave larger historical consequences than dramatic inventions remembered in written history. While archaeologists recover countless tools and broken vessels, they also uncover traces of emotional lives that rarely survive in prehistoric contexts. Burials scattered across the Green Sahara suggest that the dead were treated with care rather than abandoned. Some individuals were interred with ornaments fashioned from shells, stone beads, or animal remains. Others rested in carefully prepared positions, indicating that death carried ritual meaning extending beyond practical necessity. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives in the record suggests communities possessed complex beliefs about memory, identity, and belonging. The presence of shells offers another fascinating clue. Many originated far from the places where they were ultimately deposited. Some travelled from coastal regions hundreds of kilometres away. Such discoveries imply movement across vast landscapes, or exchange between neighbouring groups, demonstrating that no community existed in complete isolation. Even during this relatively early period, ideas and valued objects could circulate over surprising distances. Climate continued to shape every aspect of life. Although the Green Sahara was far wetter than today, rainfall still fluctuated from season to season. Lakes expanded during wet years and contracted during drier intervals. Successful communities understood these rhythms intimately. They knew where animals gathered when water levels dropped, which valleys flooded first after heavy rains, and which elevated ground remained safe during seasonal inundations. Their knowledge accumulated through careful observation passed from one generation to the next. Increasing familiarity with the landscape also encouraged experimentation. Around 8,000 years ago, evidence begins to indicate the appearance of domesticated cattle in parts of the Sahara, although scholars still debate exactly where domestication occurred and how rapidly herding spread across North Africa. Some researchers argue that livestock arrived from neighbouring regions, while others suggest local processes may have played a greater role than once believed. No single explanation fully accounts for all available evidence. Regardless of its precise origin, herding gradually introduced a profound shift in human relationships with the environment. Cattle represented more than food. They stored wealth in living form, supplied milk, provided hides and bone for tools, and altered patterns of movement. Communities increasingly balanced hunting wild game with managing domesticated animals, creating flexible economies capable of adapting to changing environmental conditions. Rock art scattered across the Sahara captures glimpses of this transformation. Earlier images emphasize abundant wildlife, while later scenes increasingly portray cattle accompanied by human figures. Some animals appear decorated or carefully attended, suggesting they possess significance extending beyond simple economic value. Whether these scenes depict ritual seasonal gatherings or everyday pastoral life remains uncertain, but they reveal an evolving society becoming more deeply connected to domesticated herds. None of these developments resemble the familiar story of civilization built upon towering cities or powerful kings. There are no vast palaces rising above these ancient grasslands, no written chronicles celebrating military victories, and no monumental walls enclosing crowded streets. Instead, the Green Sahara nurtures something quieter, yet equally remarkable communities, growing steadily more organized through cooperation, shared knowledge, technological innovation, and intimate understanding of an environment that seems almost unimaginable today. These foundations laid beside vanished lakes and forgotten rivers prepare the stage for an even more intriguing chapter, as scattered settlements begin to weave themselves into a cultural landscape stretching across one of the largest fertile regions prehistoric humanity would ever know. No map survives from the Green Sahara, yet the land itself preserves the outline of a vast human landscape. Ancient shorelines, clusters of campsites, stone workshops, burial grounds, and seasonal settlements appear again and again across territories separated by hundreds of kilometers. At first glance, these sites seem isolated, scattered almost randomly across an immense expanse. Viewed together, however, they reveal something very different. They suggest a network of communities linked not by roads or political borders, but by water movement, memory, and shared traditions. The rivers that once crossed the Sahara served as natural pathways long before anyone imagined constructing highways or trade routes. Some channels flowed only during part of the year, while others carried water more consistently through broad valleys lined with vegetation. These waterways connected lakes, marshes, and seasonal floodplains, making travel far easier than the modern desert would ever allow. Canoes may have been used on larger lakes, although direct evidence is extremely limited because wood rarely survives for thousands of years. What remains instead are fishing tools, shoreline camps, and settlement patterns that strongly imply people spent much of their lives close to dependable water. Living beside lakes offered more than food. Water naturally attracted different communities to the same places at different times of year. Families arriving to fish during one season might encounter pastoral groups moving cattle during another. Hunters following migrating antelope could meet craftspeople carrying stone from distant outcrops. These repeated encounters encouraged exchanges that reached far beyond simple survival. Ideas often travel more easily than objects, and over centuries shared customs gradually spread across enormous distances. Pottery provides one of the clearest examples of these connections. Archaeologists have identified decorative styles that appear over remarkably wide regions of the ancient Sahara. While individual communities maintained local variations, certain techniques and patterns recur again and again. Such similarities do not necessarily mean a single culture controlled the entire region. Instead, they point toward regular interaction, where neighboring groups observed one another, borrowed successful methods, and incorporated them into their own traditions. Stone tools tell a similar story. Particular methods of shaping blades and projectile points spread across broad areas while still retaining regional characteristics. Skilled craftspeople selected different kinds of stone depending on what the local landscape provided. Some favoured fine-grained chert, others quartzite or volcanic rock. Yet despite these differences, the underlying techniques often reveal shared knowledge passed from one community to another through generations of observation and practice. One especially intriguing discovery comes from the movement of raw materials themselves. Certain types of stone found at archaeological sites originate dozens or even hundreds of kilometers away from where they were eventually used. The same pattern appears in ornaments made from shells collected along distant coastlines. These materials did not transport themselves across prehistoric Africa. People carried them whether through direct travel, seasonal migration, gift exchange, or a succession of local interactions stretching across many communities. Such exchanges were probably about far more than economic necessity. Throughout human history, valuable objects often strengthen relationships between groups that may only meet occasionally. A polished shell necklace or an unusually beautiful stone blade could represent friendship. Marriage alliances shared ceremonies or mutual obligations that reduced conflict during difficult years. The archaeological record cannot reveal every social meaning attached to these objects, but their wide distribution suggests human relationships extended well beyond individual camps. The landscape itself encouraged this interconnectedness. Unlike modern deserts, the Green Sahara contained relatively few completely impassable barriers. Grasslands opened broad corridors for travel. Lakes served as landmarks visible from great distances. Seasonal rains refreshed familiar routes generation after generation. Rather than dividing people, the environment often brought them together at predictable places where resources remained abundant. Among the most remarkable windows into this world is the extraordinary rock art scattered across the Sahara's mountains and sandstone plateaus. Tens of thousands of engravings and paintings survive despite thousands of years of weathering. They depict animals, people, ceremonies, hunting scenes, cattle, wildlife, and everyday activities with striking realism. Some human figures appear swimming an image almost surreal against the backdrop of today's desert, but perfectly understandable within a landscape filled with lakes and rivers. The famous swimming figures have fascinated researchers for decades. Although popular culture sometimes exaggerates their significance, mainstream interpretation remains firmly grounded in environmental evidence. The paintings do not prove the existence of mythical lost kingdoms. Instead, they provide compelling visual confirmation that abundant water once existed where only sand stretches today. Combined with geological evidence from ancient shorelines and lake sediments, they reinforce a picture of a radically different Sahara. Other paintings reveal increasing attention to domesticated cattle. Herds appear carefully arranged, sometimes accompanied by elaborately dressed human figures. Certain animals seem unusually large or decorated, suggesting symbolic importance. Across many pastoral societies, cattle eventually become measures of wealth, social status, and spiritual identity. While scholars remain cautious about projecting later traditions backward into deep prehistory, these artistic choices hint that livestock already occupied an important place within Green Sahara society. Children almost certainly played an essential role in preserving this world, although archaeology rarely records their presence directly. Small footprints occasionally preserved in ancient mud miniature tools, likely used for learning, and the gradual accumulation of knowledge required to navigate seasonal landscapes, all imply generations raised within a stable environment, rich enough to support long-term cultural continuity. Skills such as reading weather patterns, locating hidden springs, recognizing edible plants, caring for livestock, or crafting fishing equipment required years of patient teaching. These lessons connected grandparents to grandchildren across centuries, during which the Green Sahara remained a flourishing homeland rather than a temporary refuge. Population growth likely followed naturally from this stability. Better access to food and fresh water reduced some of the pressures that had constrained earlier hunter-gatherer populations living in harsher climates. Larger communities became possible without exhausting local resources, provided people continued moving seasonally and managed their environment carefully. The evidence does not point toward crowded cities, but it does suggest landscapes occupied by many interconnected groups whose combined population may have been surprisingly large. Some archaeologists describe these societies as complex foragers or early pastoral communities, rather than civilizations. Others argue that such labels underestimate the sophistication visible in the archaeological record. They point out that complexity does not always require writing kings or monumental architecture. A society capable of maintaining long-distance exchange networks, developing specialized technologies, managing domesticated animals, producing symbolic art, and adapting successfully across vast territories, possesses its own form of organization, even if it looks very different from later empires. The debate continues because our modern definitions often emerge from civilizations that leave abundant written records. The Green Sahara leaves almost none. Its people communicated through spoken language, shared traditions, rituals, craftsmanship, and landscapes remembered rather than documented. Their history survives only in fragments patiently reconstructed from stone, bone, pottery, pollen, ancient sediments, and fading images carved into rock. As these connections strengthened across the fertile Sahara, another transformation quietly unfolded beneath the surface of daily life. Communities were no longer merely surviving within a generous environment. They were beginning to shape it in return. Herds altered grasslands through grazing. Camps repeatedly occupied the same shorelines. Sacred places accumulated memory over generations. Human influence slowly became part of the landscape itself, laying the foundations for cultural traditions that would endure even after the rains began their long and irreversible retreat. As generations passed, the Green Sahara became more than a place where people found food and water. It became a landscape filled with meaning. Certain hills, unusual rock formations, ancient trees, lake shores, and seasonal gathering places gradually acquired histories of their own. Families returned to the same locations year after year until memory itself became anchored to the land. A particular valley might be remembered as the place where ancestors first settled after the rains arrived. A lakeshore might become associated with successful fishing seasons stretching back beyond living memory. A solitary sandstone outcrop overlooking open grassland could transform into a place where ceremonies marked births, deaths, or the changing seasons. Unlike later civilizations, these communities left no temples built from enormous stone blocks and no written descriptions of religious beliefs. Yet archaeology repeatedly demonstrates that symbolic behavior flourished throughout the Green Sahara. The evidence appears quietly, rather than dramatically emerging through carefully arranged burials, decorated objects, rock art, unusual stone structures, and repeated use of specific locations over centuries. Together, these discoveries suggest that people increasingly understood their world through stories, rituals, and traditions that bound communities together. One of the clearest expressions of this symbolic world survives on the walls of sandstone cliffs. Across Algeria, Libya, Chad, Niger, and neighbouring regions, thousands upon thousands of images remain preserved in sheltered rock faces. They were created over many millennia, representing different artistic traditions as both climate and society evolved. Some are simple engravings scratched into stone. Others are vivid paintings produced using mineral pigments that have survived astonishing lengths of time despite exposure to wind and heat. The earliest images often emphasize wildlife. Massive elephants stride across landscapes now incapable of supporting even small mammals. Towering giraffes browse among trees that vanished thousands of years ago. Rhinoceroses, hippopotamuses, crocodiles, buffalo, and antelope appear in remarkable detail, demonstrating that artists observed these animals directly rather than imagining them. Their careful attention to anatomy reveals familiarity built through everyday experience. Human figures appear alongside these animals, though often in more stylized forms. Hunters pursue game with bows, spears, and coordinated tactics. Groups gather around scenes whose exact meaning remains uncertain. Some individuals wear elaborate headpieces or distinctive body ornamentation. Scholars still debate whether these images portray ceremonies' important social roles or simply artistic conventions passed from one generation to another. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single interpretation fully explains the extraordinary variety found across the Sahara. Perhaps the most famous examples are the so-called round head paintings discovered in parts of the Central Sahara. These mysterious figures possess large circular heads and elongated bodies, unlike the more naturalistic representations seen elsewhere. Early interpretations occasionally ventured into highly speculative territory, inspiring unsupported claims involving lost civilizations or even extraterrestrial visitors. Modern archaeology offers a far more cautious approach. Most researchers regard these images as symbolic or ritualized representations created within specific cultural traditions rather than literal portraits of unusual beings. Their exact meaning remains unknown, but uncertainty does not justify extraordinary conclusions. The persistence of artistic traditions over long periods suggests that knowledge passed successfully across generations. Creating detailed paintings required more than technical ability. Artists needed access to pigments, suitable surfaces, and cultural expectations regarding what deserved to be depicted. The continuity visible across many sites indicates societies capable of preserving complex traditions without relying on writing. Burial practices provide another powerful glimpse into the emotional and spiritual lives of Green Sahara communities. Human graves appear throughout the region, often carefully prepared rather than hastily dug. Some individuals rest in flexed positions, others are accompanied by beads, ornaments, stone tools, or animal remains. These objects likely held personal or symbolic significance, though their precise meanings remain beyond recovery. What survives in the archaeological record suggests that death marked an important social event rather than a simple biological ending. One remarkable discovery from Gobero in present-day Niger illustrates this humanity with unusual clarity. Archaeologists uncovered an ancient cemetery used by different populations over thousands of years. Among its burials is an adult woman laid to rest alongside two children, their bodies positioned as though embracing one another. Tiny pollen traces preserved beneath the skeletons indicate they may have been placed upon a bed of flowers before burial. While interpretations must remain careful, this scene offers a rare and deeply moving reminder that prehistoric people experienced love, grief, and remembrance every bit as profoundly as later societies. Elsewhere, stone circles and carefully arranged monuments emerge across parts of the Sahara. These constructions vary enormously in size and purpose. Some may have marked burial locations. Others could have served as gathering places or territorial markers. A few appear aligned with landscape features or distant horizons, although claims linking them to sophisticated astronomical observatories remain debated. Archaeologists emphasize that many of these structures have not yet been fully investigated, making definitive conclusions impossible. The act of constructing stone monuments itself reveals something important. Building even modest structures requires cooperation. People must gather materials, organize labor, and agree that the effort serves a purpose, extending beyond immediate survival. Such activities strengthen social bonds while reinforcing shared identities rooted in common beliefs. Animals increasingly occupied symbolic as well as practical roles. Cattle in particular became deeply embedded within artistic expression, as pastoral life expanded across the Green Sahara. Some rock paintings depict individual animals with extraordinary care, emphasizing horns, posture, and body decoration, rather than simply portraying herds. Scholars believe these images may reflect growing emotional and cultural relationships between herders and livestock. In many later African societies, cattle represented wealth, ancestry, fertility, and social prestige. Although direct continuity cannot be assumed automatically, these later traditions offer intriguing parallels that help frame archaeological discoveries. The landscape itself probably functioned as a living archive of memory. Without written maps or permanent cities, people remembered routes through stories tied to distinctive hills, rivers and rock formations. Sacred places likely preserved collective histories explaining where ancestors had travelled, which lakes first welcomed their communities, or why certain animals deserved particular respect. Oral traditions constantly renewed through ceremonies and seasonal gatherings could preserve astonishing amounts of practical and cultural knowledge across countless generations. Children growing up within these societies inherited more than survival skills. They inherited a mental map woven from geography, ancestry, ritual, and shared experience. Learning where to find water mattered just as much as understanding which places demanded respect or which ceremonies marked the return of seasonal rains. Such knowledge transformed an immense landscape into a meaningful homeland rather than an anonymous wilderness. Yet beneath this flourishing cultural world, subtle environmental changes had already begun. They were almost impossible to notice within a single lifetime. A lake that once reached a familiar shoreline now retreated slightly farther during the dry season. Certain grasses appeared later than expected after the rains. Herds altered migration routes by only a few days or weeks. No single generation would necessarily recognize these shifts as the beginning of a profound transformation. Life continued much as it always had. Ceremonies were still performed. Children still learned the old paths and communities still gathered beside generous waters. The Green Sahara seemed enduring, almost timeless. But the same natural forces that had brought abundant rainfall to North Africa were quietly changing once again. Far beyond human awareness, Earth's slow orbital rhythms continued their endless cycle. The monsoon that had sustained this remarkable world for thousands of years was beginning almost imperceptibly to weaken. What appeared to be a stable homeland was already entering the first stages of a transition that would eventually redraw the map of an entire continent and force one of prehistory's greatest human migrations. For thousands of years, the Green Sahara appears remarkably stable. Lakes rise and fall with the seasons, rivers overflow during the strongest rains, and grasslands recover after periods of grazing. Communities adapt to these familiar rhythms with confidence born from generations of experience. It would be easy to imagine this world continuing indefinitely. Yet beneath its apparent permanence, a quiet transformation is already unfolding, driven not by human decisions, but by forces operating on a planetary scale. Unlike sudden disasters such as volcanic eruptions or massive floods, the changes affecting the Green Sahara advance almost invisibly. No single storm announces the beginning of the end. No catastrophic earthquake shatters entire settlements. Instead, rainfall slowly becomes less dependable. The great African monsoon, which once carried abundant moisture deep into North Africa, begins retreating southward. This shift occurs over centuries so gradually that individual families may barely notice it during their own lifetimes. Modern climate science explains much of this transformation through changes in Earth's orbit and axial orientation. These astronomical cycles alter the amount of summer sunlight reaching the northern hemisphere. During the height of the African humid period, stronger summer heating intensifies the monsoon drawing moisture far into the Sahara. As orbital conditions slowly change, that powerful circulation weakens. Less moisture reaches the interior. Rain still falls, but not with the consistency that had sustained rivers, lakes, and expansive grasslands for millennia. The process is neither simple nor uniform. Some regions begin drying earlier than others. Certain lakes shrink while neighbouring basins remain relatively full for centuries longer. Local geography influences how quickly landscapes respond. Valleys supplied by groundwater continue supporting vegetation after surrounding plains begin turning brown. Low-lying basins retain water long after smaller ponds disappear. The Sahara does not transform all at once. Instead, it becomes an intricate patchwork of environments where abundance and scarcity increasingly exist side by side. For the people living there, these early changes likely appear as challenges to be managed rather than signs of irreversible collapse. Experienced hunters notice familiar herds arriving later than expected. Fishermen discover that shallow coves remain dry longer before seasonal floods refill them. Herders travel slightly farther to reach dependable grazing. None of these adjustments are unprecedented. Human communities have always responded to environmental variability, and the Green Sahara's inhabitants possess generations of accumulated knowledge that allow them to adapt with remarkable resilience. Archaeological evidence supports this picture of gradual adjustment rather than sudden abandonment. Settlements do not disappear simultaneously across the region. Instead, occupation patterns shift over time. Some lakeshore camps are used less frequently. Others remain active as neighbouring water sources decline. New sites appear closer to rivers that continue flowing reliably. Communities become increasingly mobile, revising seasonal routes to match changing ecological conditions. Livestock play an increasingly important role during this period. Cattle, sheep and goats provide flexibility that hunting alone cannot guarantee. Domesticated animals convert grasses unsuitable for direct human consumption into milk, meat, hides and bone. They also serve as living reserves of wealth that can move alongside their owners. As rainfall becomes less predictable, pastoralism offers an adaptive strategy capable of buffering some environmental uncertainty. Rock art reflects this changing relationship between people and animals. Earlier images dominated by wild fauna gradually give way to scenes in which cattle occupy central positions. Some paintings portray carefully managed herds crossing open landscapes. Others depict individuals leading or tending livestock, emphasizing cooperation rather than pursuit. These artistic transitions do not imply that hunting disappears altogether, but they suggest that domesticated animals assume growing cultural and economic importance as environmental conditions evolve. Even so, livestock require water. Every drying spring and shrinking lake places new pressure on herding communities. Grazing lands once capable of supporting large herds begin producing less vegetation. Seasonal migrations become longer and more demanding. Groups that previously occupied neighbouring territories with little conflict may now converge upon the same remaining water sources. The archaeological record rarely preserves direct evidence of disputes, yet it reveals increasing concentration around favourable environments. Sites cluster near dependable rivers, larger lakes and regions where groundwater remains accessible. Such patterns suggest that geography itself increasingly shapes human decisions. Communities are no longer simply choosing attractive places to live. They are following the shrinking boundaries of survivable landscapes. Environmental evidence recovered from lake sediments tells a remarkably detailed story of this transition. Layers of mud deposited year after year preserve microscopic pollen grains carried by wind and water. These pollen records reveal gradual changes in surrounding vegetation. Species adapted to wetter conditions decline while drought-resistant plants expand. Tiny fragments of charcoal indicate changing fire regimes as vegetation becomes drier. Chemical signatures preserved within sediments record fluctuations in lake levels across centuries. Together, these independent lines of evidence confirm that the transformation unfolded over long timescales rather than through a single catastrophic event. Dust provides another important clue. During the Green Sahara, extensive vegetation stabilizes soils, reducing the amount of mineral dust carried into the atmosphere. As plant cover retreats, exposed ground becomes increasingly vulnerable to wind erosion. Dust accumulation rises steadily in marine sediments off the coast of West Africa, providing an indirect but powerful record of desert expansion. Scientists studying these deposits can literally measure the Sahara's gradual return through layers of ancient airborne particles, yet climate alone cannot explain every local variation. Scholars continue investigating how human activities may also have influenced certain landscapes. Repeated grazing around water sources could reduce vegetation in localized areas. Fire used to manage grasslands may alter ecological balance. Wood gathering for fuel might affect nearby tree cover. Most researchers agree that these human impacts remained relatively small compared with the immense climatic forces driving regional drying, but they remind us that people were active participants within their environments rather than passive observers. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this period is the resilience demonstrated by Green Sahara communities. Instead of disappearing immediately, they innovate. Mobility increases, herding expands. Exchange networks likely become even more valuable as neighboring groups share information about reliable water, seasonal grazing, and distant resources. Social cooperation may have become one of the most important survival strategies available. The evidence also hints that cultural traditions adapt alongside economic practices. Ceremonial sites continue receiving attention. Artistic expression persists despite growing environmental uncertainty. Burials remain carefully prepared. These continuities suggest that shared beliefs help communities maintain stability during times of gradual change. Rituals reinforce identity, even as familiar landscapes begin transforming around them. No individual standing beside a shrinking lake could know they were witnessing one of the greatest environmental transitions in human prehistory. The shoreline simply retreats a little farther each decade. Reeds grow thinner along the water's edge. Fish become less abundant in shallow coves. The rains still come, but they arrive later and leave sooner. Life continues. Children are born elders. Pass-away ceremonies mark the changing seasons, and communities adapt once more. Yet with every passing century the balance shifts a little further. The generous world that had nurtured countless generations grows steadily less forgiving. The Green Sahara is not collapsing in a single dramatic moment. It is slowly slipping away one lake, one river, and one season at a time. Before long, adaptation alone will no longer be enough, and millions of square kilometers that once sustained thriving human societies will begin demanding an entirely different response movement into an uncertain future beyond the fading grasslands. The idea of civilization usually brings to mind towering walls, crowded cities, written laws, royal dynasties, and monuments that dominate the landscape for thousands of years. By those familiar standards, the Green Sahara appears to fall short. Archaeologists have uncovered no vast capitals buried beneath its sands, no palaces decorated with carved stone reliefs, and no archives filled with clay tablets describing kings and their conquests. For decades, this absence encouraged many scholars to view the region simply as a temporary homeland for scattered prehistoric communities, rather than a place capable of supporting truly complex societies. Yet the more evidence emerges from beneath the desert, the more the traditional picture begins to feel incomplete. Modern archaeology has increasingly challenged the assumption that civilization must always follow the same path. Human societies have developed complexity in many different forms across history. Some built immense cities. Others created sophisticated maritime networks stretching across oceans. Still others organized themselves through seasonal gatherings, shared ceremonies, extensive exchange systems, and flexible patterns of mobility, rather than permanent urban settlements. The Green Sahara may belong to this overlooked category. Scholars continue debating exactly how these communities should be described. Some prefer terms such as complex pastoral societies or regional cultural networks. Others argue that applying the word civilization risks creating unrealistic expectations because there is currently no evidence for centralized governments or formal states. The disagreement is not simply about terminology. It reflects a deeper question about what civilization actually means. If civilization requires writing, the Green Sahara almost certainly does not qualify. If civilization requires monumental cities filled with thousands of permanent residents, the evidence remains absent. But if civilization can also describe large populations connected through stable traditions, technological innovation, long-distance interaction, shared symbolic systems, organized economies, and remarkable environmental knowledge, then the Green Sahara begins to look far more sophisticated than earlier generations of researchers imagined. One reason this debate has become more active is that archaeology itself has changed dramatically during the past few decades. Earlier expeditions naturally focused on spectacular ruins that remained visible above ground. Massive temples, pyramids, fortifications, and carved monuments attracted attention because they survived the passage of time. Mobile societies, by contrast, often leave subtler traces. Camps constructed from wood hides, reeds, or other organic materials rarely survive for thousands of years. Once abandoned, wind erosion and shifting sand gradually erase nearly every visible feature. The Sahara presents an even greater challenge. Entire settlements may now lie buried beneath several meters of sand. Ancient shorelines have been reshaped repeatedly by wind. Seasonal floods have disturbed archaeological layers. Vast areas remain almost impossible to investigate because of their remoteness or difficult political conditions. Researchers have explored only a tiny fraction of the desert's enormous expanse. This means the absence of evidence cannot automatically be treated as evidence of absence. That caution has become increasingly important as new technologies reveal hidden landscapes invisible from ground level. Satellite imagery has transformed the search for ancient sites. From orbit, scientists can identify buried river channels, former lake basins, ancient drainage systems, and subtle variations in soil that betray human occupation. Radar imaging can even penetrate dry sand under certain conditions, exposing long-hidden geological features. What once required decades of ground surveys can now begin with images collected hundreds of kilometers above Earth. These discoveries have dramatically expanded the known scale of prehistoric occupation. Rather than isolated communities living independently beside individual lakes, researchers increasingly recognize broad regional patterns. Camps often appear positioned in relation to water sources, grazing lands, stone quarries, and natural travel corridors. Similar artistic traditions emerge across distant regions. Comparable pottery styles recur over remarkable distances. Shared burial customs appear among populations separated by hundreds of kilometers. None of these patterns necessarily indicate a centralized political authority. Instead, they suggest something equally fascinating: a decentralized cultural world held together through repeated interaction, rather than direct control. This distinction matters because history contains many successful societies that operated without powerful kings or permanent capitals. For thousands of years, people could cooperate through kinship networks, seasonal gatherings, ritual obligations, exchange partnerships, and shared environmental knowledge. Authority may have rested with respected elders, experienced herders, ritual specialists, or family leaders rather than hereditary monarchs. Leadership itself could have been temporary, shifting according to circumstance, instead of remaining permanently concentrated. Such systems often leave far fewer archaeological traces than royal palaces. They are also remarkably resilient. Instead of depending upon one vulnerable city, knowledge remains distributed among many communities. Resources can be shared across large territories. Mobility becomes an advantage rather than a weakness. During favourable years, people spread across productive landscapes. During difficult years, they regroup around reliable water sources while maintaining relationships with neighbouring populations. The Green Sahara appears well suited to exactly this kind of organisation. Its enormous size would have made centralised administration extraordinarily difficult, even if such governments had existed. Seasonal environmental variation encouraged flexibility rather than rigid hierarchy. Communities needed detailed local knowledge of rainfall, grazing conditions, fish migrations, and water availability. Decisions were likely made close to the landscape itself rather than imposed from distant centres. Another intriguing clue lies in the extraordinary continuity visible across thousands of years. Despite gradual environmental changes, many technological traditions persist. Pottery evolves without disappearing. Stone tool production continues adapting to new circumstances. Rock art develops new themes while preserving older artistic practices. Burial customs display both continuity and innovation. These patterns suggest societies capable of transmitting knowledge with remarkable consistency across generations. Language almost certainly played an essential role, although no direct evidence survives. The Green Sahara probably contained numerous languages and dialects just as Africa does today. Neighbouring communities may have spoken related tongues while maintaining distinct identities. Multilingual interaction could have facilitated trade, seasonal cooperation, and marriage alliances across broad regions. Without written records, these voices have vanished completely, leaving archaeology to reconstruct relationships through material culture alone. One of the greatest misconceptions about prehistoric societies is the belief that complexity appears only after agriculture becomes fully established. The Green Sahara challenges this assumption. Its people combined hunting, fishing, gathering, herding craftsmanship, and long-distance interaction in flexible ways that do not fit neatly into traditional historical categories. They were neither simple nomads wandering aimlessly, nor urban citizens living behind defensive walls. They occupied an intermediate world whose sophistication emerged through adaptation rather than monumental construction. Perhaps this explains why their achievements remained overlooked for so long. History often favours civilizations that build in stone. The Green Sahara built primarily through relationships between people and water families, and landscapes, neighbouring communities, and distant exchange partners, rituals and memory. These foundations are immensely difficult to preserve archaeologically, yet they may have supported one of prehistoric Africa's largest interconnected human worlds. Even as scholars continue debating whether the word civilization is appropriate, the evidence increasingly points toward a society that cannot be dismissed as scattered bands of isolated foragers. It represents something richer, broader, and more organized, even if organized in ways unfamiliar to modern expectations. Ironically, just as these cultural networks appear to reach their greatest maturity, the environment that made them possible continues its slow transformation. The shrinking lakes and weakening monsoon are no longer distant background processes. They are becoming the defining force that will reshape every settlement, every migration route, and every sacred landscape across the Green Sahara setting, in motion one of humanity's most profound prehistoric journeys. For centuries, the people of the Green Sahara adapt with remarkable success. They shift their camps as seasons change, guide their herds toward fresh grazing, return to familiar fishing grounds when the rains replenish the lakes and pass accumulated knowledge from one generation to the next. Their resilience is genuine. It allows them to endure environmental fluctuations that would overwhelm less flexible societies. Yet resilience has limits, especially when the environment itself begins changing in one direction for thousands of years. The weakening of the African monsoon is not dramatic enough to inspire legends of a single catastrophic day, but it is relentless. Each century brings slightly less rainfall than the one before. lakes that once seemed permanent become increasingly seasonal. Rivers that had flowed year after year begin breaking into disconnected pools during the dry months. Grasslands retreat little by little, replaced first by sparse shrubs, and eventually by open stretches of bare ground. Modern climate records preserved in lake sediments, cave formations, marine cores, and ancient pollen all point toward the same long-term pattern. Although individual regions experience temporary recoveries, the broader trend is unmistakable. North Africa is becoming steadily drier. The transformation unfolds unevenly across the landscape, but over many generations it becomes impossible to ignore. The first signs likely appear not in the largest lakes but in the smallest water sources. Seasonal ponds disappear earlier each year. Springs that had always been reliable begin failing during prolonged dry seasons. Wetlands shrink, reducing habitat for fish, birds, and aquatic plants. These seemingly modest changes ripple through the entire ecosystem. Fish populations decline as shallow breeding grounds vanish. Water birds alter their migration routes. Grazing animals must travel farther between dependable water sources. Predators follow those shifting herds while hunters find that familiar routes no longer guarantee success. Every change affects another part of the ecological web. For human communities, these environmental shifts create a growing challenge that cannot be solved through a single adaptation. Families begin extending seasonal migrations. Herds spend longer periods on the move. Fishing camps remain occupied for shorter intervals because lake levels fluctuate more dramatically. Communities that once gathered at several different lakes gradually concentrate around the few remaining dependable bodies of water. Archaeological surveys reflect exactly this pattern. Earlier occupation is spread widely across the Green Sahara, while later settlement becomes increasingly clustered around major rivers, resilient lakes, and groundwater-fed oases. The landscape itself begins directing human movement with greater force than ever before. This concentration brings both opportunity and difficulty. Larger gatherings encourage exchange of knowledge, technologies, and marriage partnerships. News about distant grazing conditions or surviving water sources spreads more efficiently when people meet regularly. Communities facing poor conditions in one region may receive assistance or information from relatives living elsewhere. At the same time, dependable water becomes increasingly valuable. Unlike fertile years when resources are abundant across broad territories, drying conditions force both people and animals toward the same shrinking landscapes. Competition does not automatically lead to violence. Human societies often develop systems of cooperation precisely because valuable resources must be shared. Seasonal agreements, kinship obligations, ritual gatherings, and reciprocal exchange may all help reduce conflict. The archaeological record, however, offers only limited insight into these social negotiations. Some skeletal remains recovered from later Green Sahara sites display evidence of injuries that may have resulted from interpersonal violence, but the evidence is sparse and difficult to interpret. Injuries could reflect accidents, hunting, isolated disputes, or organized conflict. Scholars remain cautious because no single explanation fully accounts for the available data. What's clearer is that communities increasingly invest in mobility. Portable possessions become more practical than permanent structures. Herding expands because livestock can move with changing environmental conditions. Knowledge of distant landscapes becomes an essential survival skill rather than simply useful information. Entire generations grow up expecting regular movement between seasonal destinations. Rock art quietly records this transformation. Earlier artistic traditions celebrate wildlife flourishing across broad grasslands. Later scenes increasingly emphasize herds of domesticated cattle, accompanied by human figures moving across open terrain. Animals remain central to the imagery, but the relationship has changed. Instead of pursuing unpredictable wild game alone, people now appear as managers of carefully tended herds, capable of sustaining life even as natural ecosystems become less generous. The importance of cattle extends beyond food. Milk provides a renewable source of nutrition without requiring animals to be slaughtered. Hides become clothing shelters and containers. Bones serve as tools. Horns acquire symbolic value in artistic and ceremonial traditions. Wealth can now be measured not only through immediate resources, but through living herds capable of reproducing over time. Recent scientific studies have added another fascinating layer to this story. Chemical analysis of pottery from parts of the Sahara has revealed residues consistent with ancient dairy processing. These findings suggest that some communities were exploiting milk thousands of years before it became common in many other parts of the world. Interestingly, genetic evidence indicates that most adults at the time probably lack the ability to digest fresh milk easily. Instead, they may have fermented dairy into yogurt-like or cheese-like products that reduced lactose content while preserving valuable nutrients. Such innovations demonstrate extraordinary adaptability. Rather than abandoning difficult environments immediately, Green Sahara communities repeatedly discover new ways to extract food, manage livestock, and organize seasonal life. Their response to climate change is not passive. It is inventive, flexible, and deeply informed by generations of observation. Yet even innovation cannot replace disappearing water. One by one, familiar lakes contract into smaller basins. Ancient shorelines stand abandoned far above shrinking waters. Fish species disappear from regions where they had once flourished. Trees become scarcer across expanding grasslands. Wind begins carrying greater quantities of dust, subtly altering both local weather and distant climates. For children born during these centuries, the stories told by grandparents may already describe landscapes that no longer exist exactly as remembered. A lake once crossed easily by canoe has become fragmented into shallow channels. A favourite fishing ground now dries completely before the end of summer. An old migration route followed by antelope has shifted beyond the horizon. None of these memories are false. They simply belong to a slightly wetter world. Oral traditions likely preserve these changes with remarkable precision. Human societies often remember environmental transformations through stories attached to places, ancestors, or seasonal rituals. Even without written records, knowledge of disappearing springs or changing grazing grounds can survive for generations because remembering them carries immediate practical value. Still, memory alone cannot reverse climate. By around 6,000 years ago, large portions of the once Green Sahara have become increasingly difficult to inhabit year-round. Productive regions grow smaller, seasonal movement grows longer. Communities that once occupied neighbouring lakes now travel hundreds of kilometres seeking dependable resources. The desert has not yet reached its modern form, but its advance is unmistakable. Every year the grasslands surrender a little more ground. Every decade, another stream becomes unreliable. Every century, another community must decide whether adaptation remains possible, or whether it is finally time to leave the homeland their ancestors had known for thousands of years. Those decisions, repeated across countless families over many generations, will eventually reshape the human geography of Africa. The Green Sahara is no longer simply changing. It is beginning to empty not through sudden catastrophe, but through one of the slowest and most consequential migrations in prehistoric history. No single morning marks the end of the Green Sahara. There is no final sunrise over a last surviving lake, no dramatic farewell, spoken by the people preparing to leave. Instead, departure unfolds gradually, almost invisibly, across hundreds of generations. One family decides that the nearest grazing lands no longer support enough cattle through the dry season. Another discovers that a familiar fishing ground has become too shallow to sustain reliable catches. A third simply follows relatives who have already settled beside a more dependable river farther south. Each decision appears local, practical, and temporary. Together they become one of the greatest population movements of prehistoric Africa. Migration has always been part of the human story. The earliest members of the genus Homo expanded across continents by following changing environments. Later populations crossed mountains, coastlines, forests, and grasslands whenever opportunity shifted. The people of the Green Sahara are no different. They are not fleeing a sudden catastrophe. They are responding to a landscape whose generosity is steadily fading. The first destinations are often nearby. Communities relocate from smaller lakes toward larger ones that retain water throughout more of the year. Seasonal camps become concentrated around reliable springs. River valleys capable of sustaining vegetation attract increasing numbers of herders and hunters. These movements occur repeatedly over centuries, creating a gradual southward and eastward drift, rather than a single organized migration. As conditions continue deteriorating, however, larger geographical patterns begin to emerge. To the south lies the Sahel, where seasonal rainfall remains more dependable than in the drying Sahara. Although conditions there fluctuate as well, the region continues supporting grasslands suitable for both wildlife and domesticated animals. For pastoral communities already accustomed to managing herds, the Sahel offers an environment where many familiar practices can continue with adaptation rather than complete reinvention. To the east, another remarkable landscape grows increasingly attractive. The Nile Valley, fed by rainfall falling far beyond the Sahara itself, remains one of northeastern Africa's most dependable sources of fresh water. While surrounding regions experience prolonged drying, the annual flooding of the Nile continues nourishing fertile floodplains. Communities arriving from the western deserts encounter an environment fundamentally different from the increasingly unpredictable landscapes they have left behind. Scholars remain cautious when tracing exact migration routes because prehistoric movement rarely leaves straightforward evidence. People did not travel as unified nations carrying banners or written records. They moved in countless small groups spread across many generations. Some traveled only short distances before settling permanently. Others continued migrating repeatedly as conditions evolved. Still others remained within shrinking pockets of habitable desert for centuries longer than neighboring populations. Genetic research has begun offering valuable insights into these ancient movements. Modern populations across North and East Africa preserve traces of ancestry, reflecting repeated interaction among diverse prehistoric communities. Ancient DNA recovered from archaeological sites remains limited because hot climates rarely preserve genetic material well, yet the available evidence generally supports long-term population mixing rather than complete replacement. As people moved across the continent, they encountered other communities, exchanged knowledge, intermarried, and contributed to the remarkable genetic diversity visible in Africa today. Material culture tells a similar story. Certain pottery traditions gradually appear beyond the former boundaries of the Green Sahara. Livestock management expands into neighboring regions. Stone tool technologies spread alongside migrating populations. These changes do not occur everywhere simultaneously, nor do they indicate that a single culture displaced all others. Instead, they reflect continuous interaction among many groups adapting to changing environmental realities. One of the most significant developments during this period is the growing importance of pastoralism across northeastern Africa. Communities bringing cattle, sheep, and goats into new environments introduce economic strategies refined over thousands of years within the Green Sahara. Herd management, seasonal mobility, veterinary knowledge, and understanding of grazing ecology all represent forms of expertise accumulated across countless generations. These skills prove valuable long after the grasslands that originally nurtured them have disappeared. The Nile Valley provides one particularly fascinating example. Long before the rise of dynastic Egypt, populations living along the river already display evidence of increasing social complexity. Archaeologists continue investigating the degree to which migrants from the Green Sahara contributed to these developments. The evidence suggests interaction rather than simple replacement. People familiar with pastoral life, fishing, hunting, and regional exchange likely encountered communities already adapting successfully to the Nile's seasonal rhythms. Exactly how these different traditions combined remains an active area of research. Some scholars emphasize the importance of local Nile Valley populations, arguing that Egyptian civilization developed primarily through indigenous processes shaped by the river itself. Others highlight the contribution of populations arriving from the drying Sahara, bringing livestock, symbolic traditions, and extensive knowledge of managing semi-arid landscapes. Most researchers agree that no single explanation fully accounts for the complexity visible during the prehistoric development of northeastern Africa. The Green Sahara, therefore, does not simply disappear. Its people carry elements of their world into new landscapes. They bring practical skills learned beside vanished lakes. They carry stories attached to ancestral homelands now becoming increasingly barren. They preserve artistic traditions, burial customs, and ways of organizing seasonal life. Some of these traditions gradually merge with those of neighboring communities, producing entirely new cultural expressions impossible to trace to a single origin. Meanwhile, those who remain behind face an increasingly difficult existence. Archaeological evidence indicates that parts of the Central Sahara continue supporting scattered populations for thousands of years after drying begins. Oases fed by underground water become lifelines. Mountain regions capable of trapping slightly higher rainfall provide temporary refuge. Yet these remaining habitable zones grow increasingly isolated from one another as expanding dunes separate former travel routes. The psychological dimension of this transformation is impossible to recover directly, yet it is difficult not to imagine its emotional weight. Entire generations witness familiar landscapes changing before their eyes. Children grow up hearing elders describe rivers that no longer flow. Sacred gathering places become abandoned because water can no longer sustain large seasonal meetings. Rock art, once overlooking thriving grasslands, eventually faces empty desert. The people themselves may never think of these changes as the end of their world. Human societies rarely recognize historical turning points while living through them. Daily concerns remain immediate: protecting livestock, finding water, raising children, preserving community relationships, and adapting once again to another difficult season. Only from the perspective of thousands of years does the full scale become visible. What appears to individual families as a series of practical relocations ultimately reshapes the demographic map of an entire continent. Millions of square kilometers that once supported thriving human communities gradually lose their permanent populations, exchange networks fragment, sacred landscapes fall silent. Camps once occupied generation after generation disappear beneath advancing sand. Yet disappearance is not the same as extinction. The Green Sahara survives within the people who leave it. Its knowledge travels with migrating herders. Its memories persist through oral traditions that eventually become impossible to trace back to their original homeland. Its influence spreads into neighboring regions where entirely new societies continue building upon foundations laid beside lakes that no longer exist. The desert seems to erase everything, but it rarely succeeds completely. Beneath every migrating family, every pastoral tradition carried into new territory, and every innovation preserved across changing generations lies the quiet legacy of a fertile world that refused to vanish without leaving its mark on human history. Among all the destinations chosen by the people leaving the Green Sahara, none has attracted more attention than the long ribbon of fertile land stretching through northeastern Africa. The Nile Valley appears almost miraculous when viewed against the expanding desert that gradually surrounds it. Fed by rainfall falling far to the south in the Ethiopian highlands and the equatorial lakes of East Africa, the river continues flowing even as much of North Africa grows steadily drier. Each year its floodwaters spread nutrient-rich silt across broad floodplains before slowly retreating, creating one of the most reliable agricultural landscapes on Earth. It is tempting to imagine that the disappearance of the Green Sahara directly produces the rise of ancient Egypt. The reality is both more subtle and more fascinating. Modern archaeology does not support the idea of a single migration suddenly creating Egyptian civilization. Instead, evidence points toward a long period of interaction among diverse populations already living in or moving toward the Nile Valley. Communities arriving from the western deserts join people whose ancestors have occupied the river corridor for thousands of years. Others come from regions farther south or northeast. Ideas, technologies, beliefs, and practical knowledge blend gradually rather than appearing all at once. This complexity is one reason scholars remain cautious when discussing connections between the Green Sahara and later Egyptian society. The evidence clearly indicates movement from the drying desert toward the Nile. It also demonstrates that pastoral traditions, artistic practices, and certain cultural elements spread during this period. What remains uncertain is precisely how each contribution influenced the societies that eventually gave rise to one of history's most famous civilizations. One of the strongest areas of continuity involves cattle. Throughout the later Green Sahara, cattle become increasingly central to both economy and symbolism. By the time increasingly complex societies emerge along the Nile, livestock continue playing an important role in wealth, ritual, and daily life. Archaeological discoveries from prehistoric Nile settlements reveal communities already experienced in managing domesticated animals long before the first pharaohs rule Egypt. Whether this expertise develops independently in some regions, arrives through migration, or results from interaction among multiple populations is still debated. Most researchers favor a combination of these processes rather than a single explanation. Burial traditions also offer intriguing comparisons. Several prehistoric cemeteries in northeastern Africa display careful treatment of the dead, use of ornaments, and attention to body position. Although burial customs vary considerably across both time and place, they demonstrate that complex ritual behavior predates dynastic Egypt by thousands of years. This reminds us that sophisticated symbolic traditions did not suddenly appear alongside pyramids and temples. They evolved gradually through countless generations of prehistoric communities, including those living within the Green Sahara. Rock art provides another valuable window into cultural continuity. As the Sahara dries, artistic traditions increasingly concentrate in regions that remain habitable. Similar themes involving cattle, wildlife, and human activity continue appearing across different landscapes, although local styles evolve independently. Rather than representing isolated cultures, these artistic expressions suggest populations maintaining connections, even as environmental conditions reshape their world. The Nile itself encourages new possibilities unavailable across the increasingly fragmented Sahara. Reliable annual flooding allows communities to remain in the same locations for longer periods. Permanent settlements expand. Food production becomes increasingly predictable. Population density gradually rises. Exchange between neighboring villages grows more frequent because people are no longer separated by immense seasonal migrations across open grasslands. These changes unfold over many centuries. Agriculture expands alongside continued hunting, fishing, and herding. Villages become more substantial. Craft specialization increases. Long-distance exchange networks extend farther into Africa and the Near East. Social hierarchies become more visible within archaeological remains. None of these developments occur overnight, and none can be attributed to a single migrating population. Instead, they emerge from interaction. The Green Sahara contributes people accustomed to environmental flexibility, livestock management, long-distance movement, and rich symbolic traditions. The Nile contributes dependable water-fertile soils and ecological stability, capable of supporting larger permanent settlements. Together with contributions from many neighbouring regions, these influences gradually help create conditions from which increasingly complex societies emerge. This perspective changes how ancient Egypt itself is understood. Rather than appearing suddenly as an isolated miracle beside the Nile, Egypt becomes part of a much deeper African story, stretching back thousands of years before the first written records. The foundations of later civilization are built not only upon river agriculture, but also upon countless prehistoric experiences accumulated across landscapes that have since disappeared beneath desert sands. Genetics has added another important dimension to this discussion. Although ancient DNA from the region remains relatively scarce due to poor preservation conditions available, evidence generally supports repeated population interaction across northeastern Africa during the Holocene. Human communities rarely remain isolated for long periods. They exchange marriage partners, technologies, languages, and cultural practices while adapting to changing climates. This pattern fits remarkably well with archaeological evidence documenting gradual movement out of the drying Sahara. The climate itself continues exerting enormous influence throughout these centuries. As desert conditions intensify, the Nile becomes increasingly attractive, not only because of fertile land but because of reliability. While rainfall elsewhere fluctuates unpredictably, the river's annual flood continues providing a dependable rhythm around which communities organize their lives. In many ways, the Nile replaces the network of lakes and rivers that had once sustained the Green Sahara. Yet something important has changed. Life beside the Nile concentrates people within a much narrower geographical corridor. Across the Green Sahara, communities once occupied millions of square kilometers. Along the Nile, settlement increasingly follows a ribbon of fertile land rarely more than a few kilometers wide. This concentration encourages closer interaction, more frequent exchange, and eventually forms of political organization unnecessary within the wide-open grasslands of the earlier Sahara. Environmental pressure therefore reshapes society indirectly. Climate does not force civilization into existence. Instead, changing landscapes alter where people live, whom they meet, how often they interact, and which economic strategies become most successful. Human creativity does the rest. The people leaving the Green Sahara do not know they're contributing to histories that future generations will call Egyptian Nubian or Sahelian. They are simply adapting to new realities, while carrying forward knowledge inherited from ancestors who had once fished in lakes now buried beneath hundreds of meters of sand. Many traditions undoubtedly disappear during this transition. Languages vanish without leaving written traces. Songs once sung beside vanished shorelines fall silent forever. Sacred places become inaccessible beneath advancing dunes. Entire regional identities dissolve as populations merge with neighboring communities. At the same time, countless other traditions survive by changing. Techniques for managing livestock continue evolving. Knowledge of seasonal movement informs later pastoral societies. Artistic ideas find new expressions. Social customs adapt to different landscapes while preserving fragments of older worlds. History often celebrates the civilizations that leave behind monumental architecture. Yet those monuments stand upon foundations created by generations whose names have been forgotten. The people of the Green Sahara belong among those forgotten builders. They leave few permanent structures, but they help shape demographic, cultural, and technological currents that flow across northeastern Africa long after the lakes of their homeland have disappeared. Even today, every new archaeological discovery beneath the Sahara reminds researchers that the story of civilization begins much earlier and in far more places than anyone once imagined. For thousands of years after the last permanent communities departed many parts of the Sahara, the desert continued its slow work of concealment. Wind carried enormous quantities of sand across abandoned campsites. Former river channels filled with drifting dunes. Ancient shorelines disappeared beneath layers of sediment. Organic materials decayed beneath relentless heat, leaving behind only the most durable traces of human activity. By the time written civilizations emerged along the Nile and around the Mediterranean, the fertile landscapes that had once covered much of North Africa had already faded into distant prehistory. The memory of the Green Sahara was not preserved in historical chronicles. Greek travellers described an immense desert. Roman merchants crossed harsh caravan routes. Medieval geographers mapped vast stretches of arid land. European explorers entering the Sahara centuries later encountered a landscape so dry and seemingly inhospitable that few imagined it had ever been dramatically different. The evidence remained hidden beneath their feet. Only during the 19th and early 20th centuries did scattered discoveries begin challenging the traditional image of an eternally barren Sahara. Explorers occasionally encountered fossilized shells far from any modern coastline. Hunters reported strange engravings depicting elephants and hippopotamuses carved into isolated rock faces. Travelers found polished stone tools lying across regions where permanent human settlement appeared almost impossible. At first, these discoveries seemed disconnected. Some scholars proposed that the animal images represented artistic imagination rather than observation. Others believed isolated lakes might once have existed without recognizing the enormous scale of climatic change required to support such wildlife. The Sahara was simply too vast, too dry, and too familiar in its modern form for many researchers to imagine anything fundamentally different. Gradually, however, evidence accumulated from multiple scientific disciplines. Geologists studying ancient sediments identified former lake beds extending across astonishing distances. Paleontologists recovered fossils of freshwater fish, crocodiles, turtles, and aquatic plants from places receiving almost no rainfall today. Botanists examined microscopic pollen preserved in sediment cores, revealing the former presence of grasses, shrubs, and trees now confined to regions much farther south. Each discovery strengthened the same remarkable conclusion: the Sahara had once been green. The development of radiocarbon dating after the middle of the 20th century transformed this growing realization into a coherent timeline. Organic remains recovered from archaeological sites could finally be assigned approximate ages. Campsites separated by hundreds of kilometers often proved to have been occupied during the same broad climatic interval. Ancient shorelines formed at similar times across different basins. Rock art traditions could be compared with environmental evidence rather than studied in isolation. The Green Sahara was no longer speculation. It became a scientifically documented chapter of Earth's recent history. One of the greatest breakthroughs came through the study of ancient lake sediments. As lakes gradually filled with mud over thousands of years, they preserved yearly layers containing pollen, microscopic organisms, mineral particles, and chemical signatures, reflecting surrounding environmental conditions. By extracting long sediment cores, scientists essentially opened natural archives recording climate across thousands of years. These records consistently revealed transitions from wet conditions supporting abundant vegetation to increasingly arid environments dominated by desert plants and wind-blown dust. Importantly, they also showed that this transformation was not perfectly uniform. Some regions experienced rapid drying. Others retained relatively favorable conditions for centuries longer. The Sahara did not change as a single ecological unit. Instead, different landscapes responded according to local geography, groundwater availability, elevation, and rainfall patterns. This complexity matches archaeological evidence showing that human communities abandoned different areas at different times, rather than disappearing simultaneously. Satellite technology introduced another revolution. From orbit, subtle differences in vegetation, soil moisture, and surface topography revealed enormous networks of buried rivers invisible from ground level. Dry valleys stretching hundreds of kilometers became visible through radar and multispectral imaging. Some channels proved so extensive that they rivaled major modern river systems. These discoveries fundamentally altered understanding of prehistoric North Africa. Water had once flowed through places now occupied by towering dunes. Entire drainage systems connected lakes separated by enormous distances. Travel across the Green Sahara would have followed landscapes almost impossible to recognize today. One particularly striking example involves the discovery of Paleo-River's ancient river systems now completely dry. Radar imaging has identified channels buried beneath sand that once carried substantial seasonal flows across regions where modern rainfall is nearly absent. Some researchers believe these rivers may have provided migration corridors linking distant populations throughout the African humid period. The implications extend beyond archaeology. Climate scientists study the Green Sahara because it offers an extraordinary natural experiment demonstrating how dramatically regional environments can change over relatively short geological timescales. Computer climate models attempting to reconstruct the African humid period help researchers understand interactions among vegetation, atmospheric circulation, ocean temperatures, and Earth's orbital cycles. Interestingly, these models reveal that vegetation itself plays an active role in maintaining rainfall. Grasslands and forests absorb sunlight differently from bare desert release moisture into the atmosphere through transpiration, and reduce airborne dust that might otherwise influence cloud formation. Once drying begins and vegetation retreats, feedback mechanisms can accelerate desert expansion. The Green Sahara therefore illustrates not only climate change, but also the powerful interaction between ecosystems and atmospheric processes. Archaeology has benefited enormously from these advances. Researchers no longer search randomly across immense deserts. Instead, they combine satellite imagery, geological mapping, climate reconstruction, and field surveys to identify locations where prehistoric communities are most likely to have lived. Even with these tools, however, exploration remains extraordinarily challenging. The Sahara covers approximately 9 million square kilometers. Many regions remain remote, politically unstable, or logistically difficult to reach. Excavations require transporting water, fuel, food, scientific equipment, and specialized personnel across landscapes with almost no infrastructure. Extreme temperatures shorten working hours and complicate preservation of delicate discoveries. Consequently, only a tiny fraction of potential archaeological sites has ever been investigated. This reality encourages scientific humility. Every year brings new discoveries that modify earlier interpretations. Unexpected settlements emerge beneath dunes previously thought empty. Ancient cemeteries reveal burial customs unlike those documented elsewhere. Previously unknown rock art traditions expand understanding of regional diversity. Rather than approaching a complete picture, researchers often feel they have only begun uncovering the true scale of the Green Sahara. The public imagination has naturally embraced these discoveries. Popular documentaries, books, and internet discussions frequently describe lost civilizations hidden beneath the desert. While this fascination reflects genuine curiosity, it also creates opportunities for exaggeration. Sensational claims often move much faster than careful scientific evidence. Archaeologists therefore emphasize an important distinction. The Green Sahara is extraordinary without requiring unsupported mysteries. Its significance does not depend upon vanished super-civilizations, forgotten empires with impossible technology, or mythical continents swallowed by catastrophe. The real story is already remarkable. Across one of Earth's largest deserts lay an immense fertile landscape supporting interconnected human communities for thousands of years. Climate gradually transformed that world, encouraging migrations whose consequences reached far beyond the disappearing grasslands. Much remains unknown, but every confirmed discovery strengthens this picture, rather than replacing it with fantasy. Ironically, the desert that once concealed this forgotten chapter has become its greatest protector. Sand buried fragile camps before later generations could disturb them. Dry conditions preserved rock art that wetter climates might have erased. Ancient shorelines remained frozen in place long after the waters themselves vanished. Today, every expedition crossing the Sahara carries the possibility of uncovering another fragment of that hidden world. Somewhere beneath the dunes may rest settlements, cemeteries, ceremonial sites, or entire landscapes, capable of reshaping our understanding once again, reminding us that history often survives not where people continue living, but where time quietly buries everything beneath silence. Even after more than a century of archaeological investigation, the Green Sahara remains one of the least understood chapters of human prehistory. Every answer uncovered beneath the sand seems to produce several new questions. Entire regions have yielded only scattered surveys. Others remain completely unexplored. In many places, researchers know ancient settlements almost certainly exist, yet shifting dunes, difficult logistics, and the sheer scale of the desert have delayed excavation for decades. This uncertainty is not a weakness of the science, it is part of the story itself. Unlike civilizations that left behind written records, monumental architecture, or continuous historical traditions, the Green Sahara must be reconstructed almost entirely from fragments. A broken piece of pottery may represent an entire settlement whose houses have disappeared. A cluster of stone tools may preserve evidence for generations of seasonal occupation. A single burial can transform understanding of social organization within a region that otherwise appears almost empty. Such limitations require extraordinary caution. Archaeologists are constantly balancing what the evidence clearly demonstrates against what remains possible but unconfirmed. This careful distinction often disappoints those hoping for dramatic conclusions, yet it is precisely what makes modern prehistoric research reliable. One enduring mystery concerns population size. How many people actually lived across the Green Sahara during its most favourable centuries? The answer remains surprisingly elusive. Some researchers envision relatively modest populations spread across immense territories. Others argue that the combination of abundant lakes, productive fisheries, rich grasslands, and expanding pastoralism may have supported far larger numbers than previously imagined. The available archaeological sites almost certainly represent only a tiny fraction of those that once existed, making direct estimates extremely difficult. Satellite imagery has complicated the picture even further. Each year, newly identified ancient shorelines and buried river systems reveal additional landscapes capable of sustaining human communities. Areas once assumed to have been environmentally marginal now appear to have contained permanent or seasonal water for long periods. If future excavations confirm extensive occupation in these regions, estimates of prehistoric population may require significant revision. Another unresolved question involves language. No written inscriptions survive from the Green Sahara. No bilingual texts provide clues to pronunciation or vocabulary. Every spoken language once heard beside its lakes has vanished without direct record. Linguists therefore rely on indirect evidence comparing later African language families with archaeological and genetic patterns. Some scholars suggest that important branches of modern African languages may trace aspects of their early development to populations living in or around the Green Sahara. Others argue that available evidence remains too limited for firm conclusions. The truth is that thousands of years of migration, interaction, and language change have obscured these deep prehistoric relationships almost beyond recovery. Religion presents an equally fascinating mystery. Rock art demonstrates that symbolic thought flourished. Burials indicate concern for the dead. Stone monuments suggest organized ritual activity. Yet the beliefs behind these practices remain almost entirely unknown. Did communities worship particular animals? Did lakes and rivers possess spiritual significance? Were certain mountains regarded as sacred? Did seasonal ceremonies mark the arrival of rains or the movement of herds? Archaeology can identify patterns of behavior, but beliefs themselves rarely fossilize. Every interpretation must therefore remain provisional. The famous cattle imagery illustrates this challenge perfectly. Many rock paintings portray livestock with extraordinary care and apparent reverence. Some archaeologists interpret these scenes as evidence that cattle occupied central ritual roles long before similar traditions became historically documented elsewhere in Africa. Others caution that artistic emphasis does not automatically prove religious importance. Perhaps cattle were simply the most valuable part of everyday life. Both explanations remain plausible, and the available evidence cannot yet distinguish between them with certainty. Another enduring mystery concerns leadership. Who organized large gatherings? Who mediated disputes between neighboring communities? Who coordinated construction of stone monuments or ceremonial spaces? The archaeological record offers remarkably little direct evidence for permanent rulers. This absence has encouraged some researchers to imagine relatively egalitarian societies, where authority shifted according to circumstance rather than remaining concentrated in hereditary elites. Experienced hunters may have led hunting expeditions. Respected herders may have guided seasonal migrations. Elders may have settled disagreements. Ritual specialists may have overseen ceremonies. Leadership could have existed without kings. Power could have been influential without becoming institutional. Such systems often function extremely effectively while leaving few archaeological traces. The question of social complexity therefore remains closely tied to the broader debate over civilization itself. Perhaps the greatest mystery lies hidden beneath the dunes that have never been excavated. Modern remote sensing has identified hundreds of promising locations showing clear signs of ancient human activity. Some correspond to former lakes. Others occupy strategic positions overlooking ancient river valleys. Still others contain circular stone arrangements visible only from above. Many have never been investigated on the ground. Political instability, funding limitations, and logistical challenges mean that archaeologists must choose only a handful of sites each field season from an almost overwhelming number of possibilities. Every excavation carries the potential to reshape current understanding. A single cemetery might reveal unexpected genetic relationships. A preserved settlement could demonstrate previously unknown architectural traditions. Organic remains recovered from unusually favorable conditions might clarify ancient diets, climate, or seasonal behavior. Even small discoveries often produce disproportionately large historical consequences because the existing evidence remains relatively sparse. Technological advances continue expanding these possibilities. Ground-penetrating radar drone-based mapping, isotope analysis, microscopic residue studies, and increasingly sophisticated dating techniques allow researchers to extract remarkable information from tiny fragments once considered insignificant. Residues preserved inside pottery reveal ancient foods. Microscopic wear patterns on stone tools indicate specific tasks. Stable isotope analysis reconstructs diets and seasonal movement. Chemical signatures locked within human teeth preserve clues about childhood environments thousands of years after death. Each innovation transforms ordinary artifacts into detailed historical documents. Climate science also continues refining understanding of the Green Sahara's disappearance. Earlier theories sometimes portrayed desertification as either extremely gradual or catastrophically sudden. Current evidence suggests a more nuanced reality. Different regions experience different rates of change. Environmental thresholds may have produced relatively rapid local transformations even within a broader trend unfolding across centuries. This complexity explains why archaeological evidence sometimes appears contradictory. Communities abandoned one valley while others nearby continued flourishing. Certain lakes disappeared quickly. Others persisted much longer because of favorable geology or groundwater supplies. The Green Sahara was never a perfectly uniform world, and its decline reflected that diversity. Public fascination with these mysteries has inevitably attracted more speculative ideas. Internet discussions occasionally describe hidden pyramids beneath the Sahara-forgotten global empires, or advanced prehistoric technologies erased by unknown catastrophes. Such claims usually move far beyond the available evidence. Professional archaeologists repeatedly emphasize that extraordinary discoveries require equally extraordinary documentation. So far, no credible evidence supports the existence of technologically advanced lost civilizations beneath the Sahara. Ironically, this restraint makes the genuine discoveries even more compelling. Reality already reveals a prehistoric landscape of astonishing richness. People built enduring communities without cities. They maintained exchange networks across enormous distances. They adapted creatively to changing climates. They left behind art rituals, cemeteries, monuments, and technologies that continue challenging assumptions about early human societies. The Green Sahara does not need myths to become remarkable. Its authentic story remains one of the greatest archaeological puzzles still unfolding today. Beneath millions of square kilometers of sand, countless chapters remain unread, waiting for future generations of researchers to uncover them, piece by patient piece, transforming silence into history once again. The Green Sahara has never lacked for imagination. Long before archaeologists reconstructed its vanished lakes and grasslands through sediment-caused satellite imagery and excavated settlements, travelers and storytellers filled the desert with legends. Endless horizons invited speculation. Hidden valleys suggested forgotten kingdoms. Isolated rock formations appeared like the ruins of cities swallowed by time. The sheer scale of the Sahara encouraged a simple belief that somewhere beneath its sands an extraordinary secret must still be waiting. In many ways, that instinct proved correct. The secret was simply very different from the one most people expected. Instead of uncovering evidence for a lost empire possessing impossible technologies or monuments, rivaling later civilizations, scientific investigation revealed something both quieter and arguably more profound, an immense prehistoric landscape where ordinary human communities achieved remarkable sophistication through adaptation, cooperation, and intimate knowledge of their environment. Yet the appeal of more dramatic explanations has never disappeared. Popular books, documentaries, online videos, and social media frequently describe hidden pyramids buried beneath dunes, advanced civilizations destroyed by mysterious catastrophes, or forgotten continents whose survivors supposedly settled the Sahara before vanishing without trace. These stories attract attention because they promise simple answers to complicated questions. They replace gradual environmental change with spectacular disaster and transform incomplete evidence into certainty. Archaeology, however, rarely works that way. Every excavation produces fragments rather than complete narratives. Researchers spend years comparing pottery styles, analyzing microscopic pollen grains dating charcoal samples, mapping ancient shorelines, and examining tiny variations in stone tool production. Progress is measured carefully, with each conclusion tested against multiple independent lines of evidence. The resulting picture often lacks the dramatic certainty of popular myths, but it possesses something far more valuable: reliability. Perhaps no comparison illustrates this contrast better than the recurring connection people make between the Green Sahara and the legend of Atlantis. Since the 19th century, various writers have suggested that Plato's famous account of a powerful island civilization might actually preserve memories of a once fertile Sahara. The argument usually follows a familiar pattern. Because the Sahara was once green, and because prehistoric people clearly lived there, perhaps those communities inspired later stories about a lost civilization, destroyed by environmental catastrophe. The idea is intriguing, but the evidence does not support it. Plato located Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Hercules, generally understood as the Strait of Gibraltar. His account describes a maritime power centered on an island, rather than an inland network of lakes and grasslands. More importantly, there is no archaeological evidence that the Green Sahara contained the type of centralized imperial state described in the story. Most historians regard Atlantis as a philosophical narrative rather than a literal historical account. That conclusion does not diminish the importance of the Green Sahara. It simply separates documented prehistory from literary tradition. Similar misunderstandings arise whenever unusual archaeological discoveries appear. Aerial photographs occasionally reveal circular stone formations beneath the sand. Before detailed investigation, these images sometimes circulate online, accompanied by claims that scientists have discovered ancient cities or gigantic temples. In reality, many such features turn out to be natural geological formations, burial monuments, livestock enclosures, or ceremonial structures whose true purposes remain uncertain. The distinction matters because uncertainty is not evidence for extraordinary explanations. When archaeologists describe a structure as unidentified, they mean precisely that. Its function has not yet been established. Responsible research fills that gap through excavation, comparison, dating, and analysis rather than speculation. The famous rock art of the Sahara has experienced similar treatment. The roundhead paintings, with their large circular faces and stylized bodies, have inspired countless claims involving extraterrestrial visitors or mysterious non-human beings. Such interpretations usually ignore both archaeological context and artistic convention. Human cultures throughout history have represented spiritual figures, ancestors, or symbolic concepts using highly stylized imagery. There is nothing inherently unusual about abstract artistic traditions developing within prehistoric societies. Indeed, the broader context strongly supports local cultural origins. Roundhead paintings appear alongside other clearly prehistoric Saharan artistic traditions. Their pigments, techniques, locations, and associated archaeological evidence all fit comfortably within the known chronology of the African humid period. They are mysterious because their symbolic meanings have been lost, not because they require explanations beyond human creativity. Another persistent misconception involves the supposed discovery of enormous hidden cities beneath the dunes through satellite imagery. Modern satellites are extraordinarily powerful research tools, but they do not produce instant maps of buried civilizations. Remote sensing identifies patterns worthy of further investigation. Ancient river channels, subtle topographic variations, soil differences, and possible archaeological features become visible from space. These observations generate hypotheses rather than conclusions. Only excavation can determine what actually lies beneath the surface. Sometimes radar anomalies reveal buried settlements. Sometimes they reveal ancient lake sediments. Sometimes they reveal nothing more than unusual geological formations. Scientific caution exists because experience has repeatedly demonstrated how misleading first impressions can be. Ironically, the authentic discoveries emerging from the Green Sahara are often far more significant than the myths replacing them. Climate science has shown that one of the Earth's largest deserts existed as fertile grassland within the span of recent human history. Archaeology has documented widespread human occupation across millions of square kilometers. Rock art preserves vivid records of ecosystems that no longer exist. Genetics reveals repeated interaction among populations responding to environmental transformation. Together, these discoveries fundamentally reshape understanding of African prehistory. without requiring unsupported speculation. The Green Sahara also challenges another popular assumption that civilization follows a single universal pathway. For generations, history textbooks emphasize cities, kings' writing, and monumental architecture as defining features of complex society. The prehistoric Sahara demonstrates that human organization can reach impressive levels through entirely different strategies. Mobility replaces urban concentration. Exchange networks substitute for centralized bureaucracy. Shared ritual landscapes connect communities separated by great distances. Environmental knowledge becomes a form of cultural wealth as valuable as written administration. These lessons extend beyond archaeology. They remind us that modern expectations often limit our ability to recognize unfamiliar forms of complexity. When researchers searched only for pyramids or palaces, they overlooked societies organized according to different principles. Only after combining archaeology with climate science, anthropology, geology, and remote sensing did the true scale of the Green Sahara begin emerging. Perhaps this is the greatest irony of all. The real story remained hidden, not because the evidence was absent, but because earlier generations asked the wrong questions. They searched for kingdoms instead of landscapes. They looked for monuments instead of migration. They expected emperors when the evidence preserved herders, fishers, artisans, and communities whose achievements rested upon cooperation rather than conquest. As the myths slowly fade before accumulating scientific evidence, the Green Sahara becomes even more remarkable. Its significance lies not in impossible technology or forgotten empires, but in revealing how adaptable human societies can become when surrounded by opportunity, and how profoundly they can reshape themselves when that opportunity gradually disappears. The desert still inspires legends, and perhaps it always will. But beneath its dunes, reality has already produced a story more enduring than fantasy, a world where climate memory movement and resilience combined to create one of humanity's most extraordinary forgotten landscapes. The Green Sahara disappeared thousands of years ago, yet its story continues to shape the modern world in ways that were unimaginable when the first archaeologists began excavating scattered campsites beneath the desert. What was once regarded as an isolated curiosity has gradually become a cornerstone for understanding climate migration, human adaptation, and even the origins of complex societies across Africa. Every new discovery forces researchers to reconsider assumptions that seemed secure only a generation earlier. Perhaps the most important lesson is that landscapes are never as permanent as they appear. Standing in the modern Sahara surrounded by endless dunes and bare rock, it is easy to believe this environment has always existed. The scale of the desert creates an illusion of timelessness. Yet geological evidence reveals that this seemingly eternal landscape has changed dramatically many times throughout Earth's history. Periods of abundant rainfall have alternated with long intervals of aridity, each transformation reshaping ecosystems and redirecting the paths taken by countless generations of people and animals. The Green Sahara represents one of the most recent and best documented examples of this extraordinary environmental flexibility. For climate scientists, it serves as a natural laboratory. Computer models attempting to reconstruct the African humid period must account for interactions among atmospheric circulation, vegetation, ocean temperatures, orbital cycles, dust production, and rainfall. If these models successfully reproduce the Green Sahara's emergence and disappearance, researchers gain greater confidence in their ability to understand other complex climate systems as well. One particularly fascinating insight concerns feedback loops. When rainfall increases, grasses, shrubs, and trees spread across the landscape. Vegetation stabilizes soil, reducing airborne dust. Lower dust concentrations influence cloud formation and atmospheric heating. Plants also release moisture into the atmosphere, encouraging additional rainfall. These processes reinforce one another, helping maintain greener conditions. The opposite occurs during drying. As vegetation retreats, exposed soil produces more dust. Reduced plant cover means less moisture returns to the atmosphere. Surface temperatures change. Rainfall decreases, further accelerating desert expansion. The Sahara therefore demonstrates that ecosystems and climate do not simply influence one another, they evolve together. Understanding these relationships has implications extending far beyond North Africa. Researchers studying modern drought land degradation and desertification frequently examine the Green Sahara for clues about long-term environmental resilience. While today's climate is shaped by additional factors including human-driven greenhouse gas emissions, the prehistoric Sahara illustrates how sensitive large landscapes can be to relatively gradual shifts in atmospheric conditions. Archaeologists, meanwhile, continue drawing broader lessons about human societies. For much of the 20th century, explanations of civilization often emphasized agriculture as the decisive turning point separating simple societies from complex ones. The Green Sahara complicates that narrative. Its inhabitants develop extensive exchange networks, sophisticated symbolic traditions, advanced pottery production, long-distance mobility livestock management, and remarkably detailed environmental knowledge before the emergence of large urban centers. Complexity, in other words, does not arrive in only one form. Some societies organize themselves around rivers, others around coastlines, still others around seasonal landscapes requiring continual movement and cooperation. The Green Sahara belongs firmly within this wider understanding of human possibility. It also reminds historians that absence can be deceptive. Unlike stone temples or monumental walls, mobile societies leave relatively delicate archaeological traces. Entire generations of researchers underestimated the Green Sahara because they searched primarily for architecture capable of surviving thousands of years. Once attention shifted toward campsites, burial grounds, environmental evidence, and landscape archaeology, an entirely different picture emerged. This realization continues influencing archaeological practice worldwide. Researchers investigating prehistoric regions in Arabia, Central Asia, Australia, and the Americas increasingly examine ancient environments rather than focusing exclusively on permanent settlements. Temporary occupation does not necessarily imply simple society. Mobility itself may represent an advanced adaptation to challenging landscapes. The Green Sahara has therefore changed not only what archaeologists know but how they ask questions. Genetics has experienced a similar transformation. Advances in ancient DNA recovery remain limited by the Sahara's harsh preservation conditions. Yet technological improvements continue pushing those limits. Researchers hope future discoveries may clarify relationships among prehistoric populations moving across North Africa, the Nile Valley, the Sahel, and neighboring regions. Even when ancient DNA cannot be recovered, other scientific methods provide remarkable information. Stable isotope analysis reconstructs ancient diets. Microscopic plant remains trapped in dental calculus reveal foods consumed thousands of years ago. Chemical signatures preserved within tooth enamel identify regions where individuals spent their childhood. Residues absorbed into pottery indicate cooking practices impossible to detect only a few decades ago. Every technological advance allows prehistoric people to emerge with greater clarity from archaeological silence. The Green Sahara also carries a philosophical lesson about memory. Human civilizations often believe their landscapes define permanence. Mountains seem eternal. Rivers appear fixed. Forests feel ancient beyond imagination. Yet the Sahara reminds us that environments can transform so completely that later generations struggle to believe earlier realities ever existed. Children today learn that the Sahara is the world's largest hot desert. That statement is entirely correct. It is also incomplete. For thousands of years, it was one of Africa's richest ecological regions. Both realities belong equally to its history. This perspective encourages humility. The world inherited by any generation represents only a brief moment within much longer environmental cycles. Landscapes that appear stable during a human lifetime may undergo profound transformation over thousands of years. Human communities respond not because they possess perfect foresight, but because adaptation remains their greatest enduring strength. Few prehistoric societies illustrate that resilience more clearly than the people of the Green Sahara. They do not surrender immediately when rainfall declines. They experiment. They expand pastoralism. They alter migration routes. They strengthen exchange networks. They relocate gradually toward more dependable water. When necessary, they carry accumulated knowledge into entirely new environments, contributing to societies that will eventually write the earliest chapters of recorded African history. The desert itself preserves this resilience. Ancient footprints hardened in drying mud, stone tools abandoned beside vanished lakes, paintings overlooking grasslands replaced by dunes, burials resting peacefully beneath sands that arrived centuries after mourners departed. Each discovery reminds modern observers that ordinary lives often shape history more profoundly than famous rulers. The Green Sahara was not transformed by emperors. It was built by families who fished, hunted, gathered, herded animals, raised children, honored their dead, exchanged knowledge with distant neighbors, and quietly adapted to one of the greatest environmental transitions humanity has ever experienced. Their names have disappeared. Their languages have fallen silent. Their villages have vanished beneath drifting sand. Yet their influence continues echoing across archaeology, climate science, anthropology, and the deeper story of our species. Far from representing a forgotten footnote, the Green Sahara has become one of the clearest reminders that the roots of civilization often lie hidden in places where no one first thinks to look, and that beneath the world's greatest deserts may rest not simply ruins, but entirely different ways of understanding what it means for human societies to flourish. If someone were to fly across the Sahara today, the view from above would appear almost endless in its simplicity. Vast seas of sand merge with dark volcanic plateaus. Dry mountain ranges cast long shadows across empty valleys. Salt flats shimmer beneath the afternoon sun, while isolated oases emerge like scattered islands in a landscape seemingly untouched by history. Yet beneath that immense silence lies one of the richest archaeological archives on Earth, most of it still hidden from view. The remarkable truth is that researchers are only beginning to understand how much remains undiscovered. For every well-documented archaeological site, there are likely dozens or perhaps hundreds still concealed beneath dunes, gravel plains, or ancient lake sediments. Modern expeditions often arrive with satellite imagery marking locations where subtle variations in surface texture hint at buried structures, former shorelines, or concentrations of stone artifacts. Sometimes those predictions prove astonishingly accurate. At other times, the desert reminds scientists that nature is capable of producing patterns that closely resemble the work of human hands. This uncertainty makes every expedition an exercise in patience. Unlike excavations at famous historical cities, where monuments immediately reveal themselves, prehistoric research in the Sahara often begins with almost invisible clues. A few flakes of worked stone lying across the surface may indicate an entire settlement hidden below. A fragment of decorated pottery can suggest centuries of repeated occupation. A slight rise in otherwise level ground may preserve the edge of an ancient shoreline, where thousands of people once gathered to fish, trade, and perform ceremonies. The process of excavation itself is painstakingly slow. Windblown sand must be removed layer by layer. Every object is mapped before being lifted. Soil samples are collected for microscopic analysis. Tiny fragments of charcoal seeds, pollen, and bone are preserved because they may ultimately provide more information than the larger artifacts surrounding them. in prehistoric archaeology, context is often as valuable as the discoveries themselves. A beautifully crafted stone tool tells only part of the story. Its position relative to ancient fireplaces, animal bones, pottery, and surrounding sediments reveals how people actually lived. Without that context, even remarkable artifacts lose much of their historical meaning. One of the most exciting developments in recent years has been the increasing collaboration among different scientific disciplines. Archaeologists no longer work alone. Geologists reconstruct ancient rivers. Climatologists model changing rainfall patterns. Botanists identify microscopic plant remains. Zoologists examine animal bones. Chemists analyze residues preserved inside pottery. Geneticists recover fragments of ancient DNA whenever preservation allows. Remote sensing specialists identify hidden landscapes from orbit. Each discipline contributes another piece to a puzzle too large for any single field to solve independently. This interdisciplinary approach has transformed understanding of the Green Sahara. Earlier generations often interpreted archaeological sites in isolation, describing individual camps or cemeteries, without fully appreciating how they fit into broader environmental systems. Today, researchers increasingly reconstruct entire landscapes rather than isolated settlements. An ancient campsite gains new significance when linked to a nearby buried river. A cemetery becomes more meaningful when understood within seasonal migration routes. Rock art acquires additional context when compared with pollen records documenting changing vegetation. History gradually emerges not from individual discoveries but from relationships connecting them across time and space. Despite these advances, enormous gaps remain. Many regions of Libya, Algeria, Chad, Niger, Mali, and Sudan have experienced periods of political instability that make archaeological fieldwork difficult or impossible. Valuable sites remain inaccessible for years. Others face damage from erosion, looting, modern infrastructure projects, or expanding economic activity. The Sahara protects many archaeological remains through burial beneath dry sand, yet the protection is not guaranteed forever. Climate itself continues influencing preservation. Occasional heavy rainfall may expose ancient sites while simultaneously eroding delicate features. Expanding roads and mining operations sometimes disturb archaeological deposits before they can be documented. Increasing tourism to certain rock art locations has also created challenges requiring careful conservation to balance public access with long-term preservation. International cooperation has therefore become increasingly important. Researchers from Africa, Europe, North America, Asia, and many other regions now work together alongside local communities, combining expertise and resources while emphasizing that the Green Sahara represents a shared chapter of global human history rather than the heritage of any single nation. Local knowledge often proves indispensable. Nomadic pastoralists traveling across remote regions frequently know locations of rock shelters, unusual stone formations, or ancient artifacts long before archaeologists arrive. Generations of experience navigating the desert allow them to recognize subtle landscape features invisible to unfamiliar visitors. Many important discoveries have begun with conversations between researchers and local guides, whose understanding of the terrain reflects centuries of accumulated observation. Technology continues opening possibilities unimaginable only a few decades ago. Artificial intelligence increasingly assists in analyzing satellite imagery, identifying patterns too subtle for rapid human recognition. Machine learning algorithms compare thousands of square kilometers of terrain, highlighting locations where buried river systems or archaeological features are statistically more likely to occur. These tools do not replace traditional fieldwork, but they dramatically improve its efficiency. Drone surveys provide detailed maps of remote landscapes. Three-dimensional laser scanning records fragile rock art before weathering causes irreversible damage. Portable laboratories allow preliminary chemical analyses directly in the field. Every technological innovation extends the reach of archaeology into landscapes once considered almost impossible to investigate systematically. Yet even with these remarkable tools, discovery retains an element of chance. A shifting dune may expose a burial untouched for 6,000 years. An unusually wet season might reveal the outline of an ancient shoreline. Construction of a modern road can unexpectedly uncover prehistoric settlements hidden beneath shallow sediments. The Green Sahara continues surprising researchers precisely because so much of it remains unexplored. Perhaps the greatest challenge lies not in locating new evidence, but in interpreting it responsibly. Every exciting discovery attracts public attention. Media headlines sometimes proclaim that scientists have found a lost civilization or rewritten history forever. While such phrases generate enthusiasm, they rarely capture the careful process through which scientific understanding actually develops. One excavation does not overturn decades of research. Instead, it adds another carefully examined piece to an expanding body of evidence. The Green Sahara has taught archaeologists the value of gradual understanding. Its story emerged through thousands of small observations accumulated across generations of research, rather than through a single spectacular revelation. The most important discoveries often begin as modest fragments, whose significance becomes apparent only after years of comparison with evidence collected elsewhere. That slow accumulation mirrors the history of the Green Sahara itself. Its communities did not appear suddenly. They developed gradually. They adapted patiently. They transformed alongside changing climates over thousands of years. Even their disappearance unfolded through countless individual decisions rather than one dramatic event. In many ways, the science studying this forgotten world has followed the same rhythm: patient, incremental, built upon cooperation, guided by evidence rather than certainty. As archaeologists continue uncovering new traces beneath the dunes, the Green Sahara steadily changes from a forgotten landscape into one of the best examples of how deeply interconnected climate, environment, culture, and human resilience have always been. The desert has not surrendered all its secrets, and perhaps it never will. But with every season of research, another small piece of that remarkable world rises once more into the light. The Sahara is often described as a place that erased its past. At first glance, that description seems entirely appropriate. Rivers vanished, lakes evaporated, grasslands became dunes, villages disappeared beneath drifting sand until even their existence was forgotten. Yet the deeper archaeologists look, the clearer another truth becomes. The desert did not erase its history. It preserved it in an unfamiliar way, scattering the evidence across an immense landscape, and asking future generations to assemble the pieces with patience rather than certainty. The story of the Green Sahara ultimately reaches far beyond one region of North Africa. It reshapes the way humanity understands its own beginnings. For centuries, historical narratives often focused on civilizations that left behind monumental architecture, written records, and identifiable rulers. Those societies remain extraordinary achievements, but they're only one expression of human success. Long before cities dominated river valleys, people learned to thrive across vast, changing landscapes through cooperation, mobility, innovation, and deep ecological knowledge. The communities of the Green Sahara demonstrate that civilization, however it is defined, cannot be measured solely by walls of stone or the survival of written documents. Their greatest achievement may have been their relationship with the land itself. They learned the seasonal rhythms of rivers that no longer flow. They understood the breeding cycles of fish inhabiting lakes that have vanished. They guided livestock across grasslands now buried beneath hundreds of meters of sand. They created artistic traditions that still communicate across thousands of years, despite the disappearance of the languages once spoken beside those painted cliffs. Knowledge became their architecture. Memory became their library. Movement became their road network. Shared traditions became their institutions. These forms of complexity rarely survive as visibly as pyramids or temples, yet they shaped countless lives across millennia. The Green Sahara also reminds us that environmental stability is always temporary. To the people living beside its lakes, the fertile landscape must have seemed enduring. Children grew into adults believing rivers would continue flowing much as they always had. Grandparents passed familiar migration routes to younger generations. Ceremonies returned to the same sacred places year after year. The changes remained almost imperceptible within individual lifetimes. Only across centuries did the full transformation become visible. This gradual pace carries an important lesson. Human history is often imagined as a sequence of dramatic turning points, great battles, revolutions, or natural catastrophes. Yet many of the most significant changes unfold so slowly that nobody living through them recognizes their historical importance. A shoreline retreats a few meters. A rainy season arrives slightly later than expected. Grazing becomes a little more difficult. Families travel a little farther each year. Each adjustment appears manageable. Together they transform an entire continent. The disappearance of the Green Sahara therefore represents not simply environmental change, but one of humanity's greatest demonstrations of adaptation. Its people do not remain trapped within a failing landscape. They adjust their economies. They expand pastoralism. They strengthen exchange networks. They relocate toward dependable water. They merge with neighboring populations. They carry inherited knowledge into unfamiliar environments. Their survival depends not upon resisting change, but upon learning from it. This flexibility becomes one of the defining characteristics of our species. Again and again throughout prehistory, humans respond to shifting climates by reorganizing rather than surrendering. Ice sheets advance and retreat. Coastlines rise after the end of the last ice age. Forests expand. Grasslands contract. Rivers alter course. Each transformation creates new challenges but also new opportunities for societies capable of adapting. The Green Sahara stands among the clearest examples of that enduring pattern. It also challenges older assumptions about Africa itself. For much of modern history, prehistoric Africa was often portrayed as a passive backdrop to developments occurring elsewhere. That perspective has steadily collapsed under the weight of archaeological evidence. Across the continent, researchers continue uncovering remarkable records of innovation, environmental adaptation, symbolic thought, technological creativity and cultural diversity, extending deep into prehistory. The Green Sahara occupies a central place within this expanding understanding. Rather than existing on the margins of history, it becomes one of the great laboratories in which human societies experimented with new ways of living. Its influence likely extended through migration, cultural exchange, and technological innovation into neighboring regions, contributing to developments that eventually shaped some of Africa's earliest complex civilizations. Yet perhaps the greatest legacy of the Green Sahara is neither technological nor political. It is intellectual. It reminds modern observers that landscapes possess histories as rich and dynamic as the people who inhabit them. The desert visible today is only one chapter in a much longer story. Beneath its dunes lie traces of forests, rivers, wetlands, wildlife ceremonies, laughter, grief, craftsmanship, and generations of ordinary people whose lives unfolded with hopes and concerns remarkably familiar, despite the vast gulf of time. Every polished stone tool once fit comfortably in someone's hand. Every decorated pot was shaped by careful fingers. Every painted animal reflected a memory of real creatures crossing living grasslands. Every burial represented people mourning someone they loved. These quiet details prevent prehistory from becoming abstract. They remind us that history is ultimately built from individual lives. Even now, the Green Sahara continues changing our understanding. New satellite missions reveal buried landscapes previously unknown. Fresh excavations uncover settlements where none were expected. Climate models become increasingly sophisticated. Scientific techniques extract astonishing information from microscopic traces preserved within pottery sediments and ancient bones. The story remains unfinished. Future discoveries may refine current interpretations, challenge long-held assumptions, or reveal entirely new chapters hidden beneath untouched stretches of desert. That openness is one of archaeology's greatest strengths. Its conclusions are never final because the evidence itself continues growing. The Green Sahara therefore remains both an ancient world and a living scientific frontier. Across its immense silence, the desert still guards countless unanswered questions. Some may remain hidden forever. Others will emerge slowly through careful excavation, patient analysis, and international cooperation among researchers determined to understand the remarkable landscape that once flourished where almost nobody would now expect it. In the end, perhaps that is the most enduring image of all, not a lost civilization swallowed by myth, but a fertile world that quietly transformed into desert, while its people carried fragments of that vanished homeland into the future. The lakes disappeared, the rivers dried, and the grasslands faded beneath the sand, but the knowledge, resilience, and humanity forged within that green landscape continued their journey, leaving traces that still shape the story of our species today. The Sahara appears quiet now, in a way that almost defies imagination. Wind moves patiently across the dunes, smoothing away footprints almost as soon as they appear. The rocks absorb the day's heat before releasing it into the cool desert night. Stars emerge above a landscape that seems untouched by time, and it becomes easy to believe that this immense desert has always belonged to silence. Yet beneath that silence rests another world. Far below the drifting sand lie the faint outlines of ancient shorelines where waves once reached the land. Stone tools remain where they were set down thousands of years ago. Fragments of pottery still hold traces of meals shared beside vanished lakes. Burials continue their quiet vigil beneath the earth, untouched by the generations that followed. Rock paintings gaze across horizons that no longer resemble the landscapes their creators once knew. The people who lived here did not know they were standing at the edge of one of history's great transformations. They simply adapted season after season as the rains became less reliable and the lakes grew smaller. They carried children to new homes, guided their animals toward distant water, and passed on everything they had learned about surviving in a changing world. They could not preserve the grasslands themselves, but they preserved something just as enduring: the ability to begin again. Perhaps that is why the Green Sahara continues to resonate so deeply today. Its story is not only about a lost landscape, it is about the quiet resilience that has followed humanity through every age. Civilizations rise and disappear. Rivers change course. Forests spread and retreat. Deserts advance where wetlands once flourished. Across all of these transformations, people continue observing, learning, adapting, and carrying memory forward into places their ancestors never imagined. The desert still keeps many of its secrets. Somewhere beneath the dunes, another forgotten campsite may be waiting to emerge. Another ancient shoreline may still be hidden below layers of sand. Another piece of pottery, another painted shelter, another burial, or another abandoned hearth may one day add a small but meaningful detail to this remarkable story. Until then, the Sahara remains both a monument and a mystery. It reminds us that history is often written not only in great cities or towering monuments, but also in landscapes that quietly change beyond recognition. Sometimes the greatest chapters of the human story are the ones hidden in plain sight, waiting patiently beneath the surface until curiosity, science, and time bring them back into the light. And as the evening wind continues its endless journey across the desert, it passes over a land that remembers rivers, remembers grass, remembers footsteps long since vanished, and in its own silent way still remembers the people who once called this green world home.